Welcome to episode 452 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I am republishing an interview from the Endurance Innovation podcast, where I was interviewed by host Mikael Liberzon on topics such as social media information and misinformation, decision-making regarding implementation of training interventions and technology, some specific concepts for evaluating devices, technology, and metrics, and probably some other topics that I'm forgetting about right now. I've republished some interviews like these in the past when I've been interviewed, and I know a lot of you listeners really enjoyed that, so hopefully that will be the case here as well. But I'm, as always, very curious to hear your feedback on this episode. But I have to say I'm particularly happy about bringing you this interview on these topics because they are topics that I'm very interested in and passionate about, and that I think contribute a lot to how I coach, to my coaching philosophy or methodology. And this will, I think, give you more insight into how I think about various things and how that contributes to my coaching. By the way, this episode should go out sometime at the very end of the year, that is 2024, if you're listening back in the future. So I hope that you're having a very happy holiday season so far, and that 2025 will bring you lots of joy, happiness, and triathlon. We'll get right into the interview right after thanking our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. As you know, they create carbohydrate products like gels, drink mix, and chews, and electrolyte products that are effective, practical, and tasty. Their products are designed to make it very easy for you to execute your fuel and hydration plan. They have taken into account things like the amount of carbs, the amount of electrolytes in each serving, of course, how flavorful they are, what the taste is like, so that you can keep using the same product throughout a long race. And all of this is no small thing, because not being able to execute and follow your nutrition and hydration plan can make or break a race. But what's also very important is that they have many ways in which they can help you create your nutrition and hydration strategy in the first place from their free fuel and hydration planner. They even have free consultations with sports scientists, and they have a massive database of case studies, along with a number of really great informative articles on their blog. So I definitely recommend that you check out precisionfuelhydration.com for all of that. Even if you don't use their products, the resources are amazing. But I recommend the products, of course, and as a TTS listener, you can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Now, without any further ado, let's get into this interview where I was interviewed by Mikael Liberzon on the Endurance Innovation podcast.
Yeah, so again, like big picture kind of, we'll start big and we'll maybe zoom in a little bit. But big picture is, anyone who has been in this sport for any length of time can appreciate the fact that there are innovations on all fronts, in terms of training methodologies. You hear about, the Norwegian method is pretty hot right now on the philosophy of training, of how, how you would approach it. Obviously technology, and, we, shameless plug here, have recently released a piece of kit that we think is going to make a real difference in the cool bottle and cooling on the bike. So there are technological innovations. There's listeners to our show, obviously you'll know that we talk a lot about cooling, but also aerodynamics. There's a brand new head unit from Wahoo that has an aero sensor built into the head unit as a first. We're trying to get them on the show. So Wahoo, if you're listening, come and talk to us. So there's just so much new stuff coming up, and it's very easy if you are plugged into that, that flow, that fire hose of information, I would say. It's very easy to get lost and to, maybe make some decisions that are less optimal. So why don't we start there? Let's start with the flow of information. So the input that often comes from, let's say, from social media. Michael, do you consume that stuff? Do you look for the diamonds in that rough, or do you skip that altogether?
It depends. Right now, I find that sometimes I guess I don't really consume much in terms of like actually trying to educate myself on social media. However, I do consume social media. I recognize the doom scroll. Right now, I am logged out, and I find that logging myself out, then that often helps me stay out of social media for a few weeks or a month or so, and that's always a good time. And then sometimes I need to log in again. I need to post something, and then if I don't log myself out again, then it's not that I try to educate myself there so much, but it's more that I guess I end up wasting a lot of time there, or too much time for my liking. But the flow of information and how to consume it, I think, if like, I don't know, we have like in terms of a sub point there, we could discuss like how do you figure out on social media or wherever, like different sorts of different media, or even like people that you might know in person, people in your training group that come with information. Like how do you figure out what is good who provides good information, who provides bad information, and who is misinformed, who is well informed?
That was going to be my follow-up question, is like, okay, so obviously, social media, I think we can agree, is probably not the most, not the best curated from a utility and viability perspective. They're there to keep you glued to their screens. But then how do you select those sources of information? And maybe you can share a personal example of what you do or what you found effective for, folks you work with.
Yeah. And there are some good accounts on social media, I think a key thing for me is that I think it's very hard with short form content to provide like a good, nuanced, balanced perspective on any topic, no matter how good you are. So I would always prefer long form content. So that could be podcasts or blogs or longer YouTube videos, not YouTube shorts. Instagram, Twitter, it's pretty hard to provide like the level of nuance and the level of perspective that is needed to really actually get something useful out of any topic, any kind of information, even though Twitter used to be great with lots of active, like really good people active on there. So you could have good conversations with that. Instagram, I think, is it's just about getting attention, but there are still some good accounts. There is now Knowledge is What, which is a pretty good account that summarizes some research, and YLM Sports Science has been around for a long time. Same thing, there are infographics about sports science. So it's good information. However, it is generally like just a summary of what a research study said. So it doesn't really, and that is very limited information. Like you might say, well, it's published research. Yes, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't know the context of the rest of the picture. But I think that, you can follow good accounts like those, and that can give you some good information. But what's really important with social media, I think, is to avoid the misinformation, because that's a big pitfall.
Yes.
And generally, most people don't get an extremely big social media following by presenting balanced and nuanced views on things. Unfortunately, it's
citing their references. Yep.
Yeah, so the very biggest accounts, I'm not talking necessarily in terms of in a niche like triathlon, but in general, the very big accounts are often ill-informed or alternatively motivated.
Yes.
So that's one thing to look at. A few other, I would say, I have wrote down some notes about what are the things to look for whether a person is kind of trustworthy or has credibility. First of all, do they have good credentials to talk about the topic they're talking about? Because you can have, medical doctors talking about politics. That's not to say that they can't know about politics, but that's not necessarily what they're like. They need to have you need to check what their credibility level is. But also, just because you have credentials, you being a medical doctor doesn't mean that you don't spread misinformation, or somebody being a well-educated coach with a background in sports science and having coaching certifications, that doesn't mean that they don't spread misinformation. So that doesn't guarantee anything, but that's a good first step to look for, at least.
Makes sense.
Then the second and probably most important point, I would say, is looking at the actual content. Is the content detailed, nuanced? Does it provide a full perspective? Does it provide pros and cons of different things? Or is it simplified and sensationalized? That would, obviously, the latter would more imply some level of misinformation, similar to if there are very big claims being made for lose 10 kilos in a month or things like that, or clickbait. That's clickbait and a big claim in one. So those are often go hand in hand with misinformation. If the person or the account, the entity, are they polarizing and antagonistic? I think this is a pretty big thing, because that's also something that drives engagement, and it drives views and clicks, I guess, I think it's human nature in some way. So
sure,
but that's not a sign of a well-informed person necessarily, or credibility. Like, it's more a sign of somebody that's trying to get attention, to be polarizing and antagonistic. And then the final thing is I would say, is if you see somebody posting something and you're wondering if that is the veracity of that statement can be trusted or not, then you can look at previous content that they posted and see if that seems trustworthy. And for example, if I posted a year ago about how you can treat depression by shining light into your ears, which is that is a claim that some companies have made in the past based on extremely poorly conducted research. But if I post that claim, then that probably also disqualifies me from now posting about how to treat COVID-19 or whatever. So, or it doesn't disqualify me, but it makes it less likely that I'm a well-informed source of information. Let's put it that way. So I think that you can look at the bigger picture of what else is the account posting, because it's pretty easy, especially in the world of fitness and health and so on. Everybody can post things that are generally good to that. Yeah, you need to eat fruits and vegetables, you need to sleep, those sort of things. So, but then you can have these kind of wacky statements thrown in every fourth or fifth post that are really out there and extremely misinformed. And then people can think that, well, this must be a credible account because they're kind of posting all the right things. So this kind of strange thing maybe also holds true, but that's not really necessarily the case. So yeah, you can kind of need to dig a bit deeper maybe with what the other statements that a person or an account has made before are to really be able to verify if they are informed or not. But of course, that is hard because you're also not an expert in that topic necessarily.
That's why you're there, right? Like that. Yeah, we're talking to the folks who are trying to get the correct information that helps them train or get the right thing to make them experience their sport better. Yeah. It's really difficult for that reason, because and it's also like a lot of the big accounts of people that are successfully, I guess, spreading misinformation. If we put it bluntly, many of them do it in a way that seems very sophisticated, or you could say that it is sophisticated. It looks polished, it looks sciencey, and it's very easy to believe. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just want to emphasize something that you mentioned, that the big social media platforms, their business model is to keep your attention for as long as possible. So they're going to emphasize those posts or those videos that get attention, get clicks, get engagement, and de-emphasize the perhaps the more rigorous and ultimately more useful, but perhaps less eye-catching posts of folks who have real information. So let's put social media aside. I think we both agree, and I don't think we'll get much pushback, that social media is not where you should be doing your robust research into anything, including our sport, of course. So then what's your go-to for sure, if you have some idea, something that you want to research and learn about, we can talk about that later. You can, if you have a specific topic, you can investigate it. But what if you're looking for sort of general information, or something that I like to do is I want to, I don't know what I don't know, kind of a trivial statement. But there are certain sources that I have that I go to for almost like inspiration, to open new avenues in my ways of thinking. But I want that source to be trustworthy. What's your go-to for that kind of stuff? Oh, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I think I know I threw you a curveball. I didn't put that in the questions in our email. No, I think a lot of that comes through conversations with coaches and athletes. I mean, that's having a podcast where I interview coaches and athletes, coaches especially, means that is a very good avenue for doing that. I am also a big podcast listener in general, so I listen to other podcasts, and sometimes you hear very interesting things there. Or I'm less prolific or a YouTube watcher, but every once in a while I watch something on YouTube and see something interesting there. So reading books, not necessarily triathlon related, but yeah, I think just for creativity, for broad ideas, books are really good, I would say. So yeah, still conversations, whether they be in person or online, virtually, with coaches and athletes, that would probably be the main one. And it can be conversations with athletes that I coach myself, that they come with ideas they've heard something. So those, and of course with the other coaches within Scientific Triathlon, we have regular meetings where we chat and the WhatsApp group and everything. So those are some of the biggest
the biggest avenues for me for getting those sorts of new ideas and then maybe deciding to dig deeper into a topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that very much resonates with kind of my experience. I do like the podcast avenue. I think there's a few shows out there, yours of course included, that open up ideas for me. And then there's a few columnists I read too in like the press, the endurance press. Like I get a lot from Alex Hutchinson, does a really good digest email for Outside. Like so many of my ideas, it should be, if this podcast made any money, I should be paying him royalties, because so many of my ideas for shows or for like, something that sparked an idea for a show that maybe evolved come from the articles that he posts. So he's a really good one for me. But what you said about conversations, that totally rings bells, because I think when you have that kind of dialogue, and this is why I also really like running a podcast. And this is, listeners, we probably will have released this by now. I had a chat with Bjorn Kafka of Aerotune. And I always really like talking to him, because that guy is always working on something new and something different. And I always learn so much from those conversations. So yeah, running a podcast is definitely, it's kind of a niche way to do it, but I think it's a really fun way to do it.
Yeah, what you mentioned before we started recording from your conversation with Bjorn about trail runners running 25 hours a week. That's for example something that obviously in triathlon we're time limited with training for 3 sports, but also I do think that there is this, like there are different schools of thought, but a pretty big school of thought is to not run very much, because it comes with larger injury risk, and it does come with larger injury risk. That doesn't mean that you can't run quite a lot, and it's all contextual, right? But that is a great example of how, like, that sort of idea that might seem very extreme from a triathlon perspective can open your mind to the possibilities and make you think a bit differently about things.
100%. And even Bjorn, like the way that he was really surprised by it himself, he was just relating an anecdote. He was approached by an elite female trail runner who wanted to work with him. And when he was, trying to understand what her training volume was, she told him how much she was running. And he was like, this is impossible. I can't believe these numbers. And then he, of course, obviously she was running that much and she was being healthy about it. So yeah. And that was, to your point earlier, these new kind of new ways of understanding our world a lot of times come from conversations with our, coaches, athletes and peers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, that's great. I think maybe what I'll ask you to do is, and you can list some of them now and we can put them in the show notes, but if you have any go-tos for reliable sources of information for podcasts or channels, I know you mentioned a couple of Instagram channels. Again, I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't ask you this in the email. So if you want to think about it and then send me an email that I can add to the show notes, we can do it that way too.
Yeah, no, I think Alex Hutchinson that you already mentioned is great. I try to look for different podcasts where athletes or coaches are interviewed. The Triathlon Hour has a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, that's probably the main one, the Triathlon Hour, with a lot of like long form interviews, where especially I think in the early days, like there were a lot of talk about training on that podcast, and maybe less so now, but there's still some really good stuff there. So I enjoyed that pod. And for running, I like Magnus and Marcus on coaching podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great podcast. Yeah.
I'll think about some other ones and send them to you later.
Sure. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm a big fan of Steve Magnus. I actually read a lot of his stuff that he puts out. He had a couple of really good books with Brad Stolberg on just like performance and success, which I sort of like his philosophy. This is a digression, but his philosophy jives with mine of kind of like really, focusing on what you can control and that kind of stuff and not sweating the little things, focusing on the big stuff and just getting things started. I'm totally butchering it, but yeah, I really like his work as well. Yeah. So why don't we shift gears a little bit, and then let's assume that the information that you have found is sound, like it's got some pretty good evidence based for you believing it. There's still so much of it out there. And then there's I mentioned the Norwegian method earlier. There's some evidence, there's some good evidence for the Norwegian method being effective, doing a lot of that threshold work, even like doubles of threshold. And I'm far from even very knowledgeable with the Norwegian method, to be honest. But there's so many other ways of training. And I think you and I have talked about this in the past of like, whether or not you're going to do, the pyramidal or polarized training or just do lots of volume. There's so many ways if we're going to stick to training for now. How do you figure out as an athlete or as a coach, what are you going to try? What do you think is going to work?
Yeah, I think, I would start with, if you break it down into 5 steps, I would start with just assessing any given, let's say, training intervention, but it could apply to other things, to like a new device, technology of some kind, or a new metric. But for training intervention, start with like step 1, reflecting on it, researching the background of it a bit more. So if it's something like, first, if you're talking about the training method, doing the research so you understand exactly what it's about and what is the kind of claim mechanism for its effectiveness and what are the claim results, all of that background. Then reflecting on it in the context of what you already know anecdotally from your own training or your own coaching, from others, your friends, your colleagues, what you've heard elsewhere, what you've read elsewhere. Does it make sense? Is this how a lot of people train and do they have good results with it, or is it quite the opposite? So reflecting on that. Then also step 2 would even be, I would say, thinking about the history of that training method, because things generally, in terms of training interventions at least, there aren't a lot of new things. Things may become a bit more sophisticated and they may look different because you have different data sources, more ways of measuring things and more ways of being exact about things, but the actual training methods are probably very similar to what has already been done before. So I think that it's good to be knowledgeable about the history of different schools of training in different sports and reflecting on that and how effective this method was last time it was around and it was popular.
Sure.
So that's, I think that the next time that the whole low carb movement comes around, I'm sure that will come around again. People would do well to go back and reflect on how it did the first time. So that's just as one example.
Yes.
Same thing with like extreme high volume training, and like there are lots of things that you can think of, but high intensity training has been around in many cycles. Threshold training has been around in many cycles, and so on. So there's not like a lot of really new things. So that's step 2, and step 3 is to really like take what you now know, now that you have like had this chance to reflect on the current and the past and the research that you've done, put that into the context that you're going to apply it. So if you're an athlete, what is your context? Are you an elite athlete? Are you a junior athlete? Are you an age group athlete? Are you an Ironman athlete doing an Ironman in 9 hours or in 17 hours? Are you a 10K runner? Well, how fast are you? Are you male or female? How old are you? What is the climate where you live? Like there are all sorts of things that matter here in the contextual setting of where you will apply the training intervention potentially. So if there is a lot of research on a given training method, but it's all done in recreationally trained athletes, but you're a very well-trained professional world-class athlete, then that's not necessarily super relevant. The research might not apply to you because there hasn't been a lot of research done in the correct context. And research is definitely not everything. It's actually only a small part. But then you would also look at, obviously, well, anecdotally, what do you know other athletes of your level that in the past or now are using that training method, and what does that look like? Does it seem to be effective? Does it make sense for you to do it? So reflect on how you fit into the puzzle of whether this training intervention may be effective. So context is king.
Let's talk a little bit about how you would go about doing that. I think it makes perfect sense what you're saying. But if I'm an age group athlete, and let's say I've been around a little while, and I have maybe a small circle of triathlon friends who also do the sport that I do, how do you then do what you just recommended? How do you find out whether or not this specific kind of training would be appropriate for somebody of my ability, which, like I said, makes perfect sense. But who do you talk to? Like, where would you get that information? What are your reliable sources there?
Well, the best thing would be to have a coach or even get a consultation with a coach, because have that experience with many athletes in different contexts, and they also stay up to date on these things. So they have a fuller picture and an easier time of acquiring a full picture because they talk with their colleagues. So they have information from other coaches and not just athletes that they coach themselves and so on. So that would be the best thing. Yeah. Otherwise, I guess you can call sort of like you end up forming more of a picture the more you like study the sport. So that might mean reading books, listening to podcasts, again, with all the caveats of the difficulty with filtering information. But if you do that with a kind of a like with some critical thinking, then you end up more and more forming a picture of things that have been done, things that have been successful, and things that have been done not so successfully, and it's a process that takes a long time. And that is the benefit of a coach, to be honest, that they have gone through that. They are always going through that. They're spending their whole day doing that. But you can do it as a self-coach athlete as well. But it's not a quick fix, really. It's something that you just have to be a student of the sport, really.
Mm-hmm. Where do you fall on experimentation? Just like, just trying it.
I think that's the way to go. Like when you've done your due diligence, I think you should always do your due diligence. Don't just jump onto the bandwagon of something. So think about it before you do it, with those steps that we talked about, and then if it seems that okay, this could be an interesting possibility, then you experiment with it. Then you do a trial. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing to caveat this with, though, is that you're not just comparing any training intervention with null. You're not comparing it to doing nothing. Yes. So the risk of any training intervention at a minimum is opportunity cost. Mm-hmm. So you might not get slower, but you might not get faster. And in that case, another training method could have made you faster. So you're, relatively speaking, you're losing out. So you should probably you shouldn't assess any training intervention in isolation, but also compared to what you're doing right now. For example, is it better or possibly more effective than what you're doing right now? Or are you weighing two potential different avenues against each other? So, and then make an as informed decision as you can on which has the highest likelihood of being successful. You will never know that in advance, but you have to kind of do the due diligence and then decide based on what you know and what you can guess and speculate about, and then you do an experiment. So then you just trial, and then I guess the thing, like, it's not going to be a scientific experiment. It's not going to be well controlled, but still, I think that as long as you do it with reflection throughout the process, and thinking about in advance about where are you supposed to be able to somehow measure the success of this. Are there specific workouts where you will be able to see your progress in terms of the power output, the paces, and or the external to internal ratio, so pace to heart rate or power to heart rate, mm-hmm. those sorts of things? Or are you going to actually maybe do some testing before and after? Or do you have a race that you have done before and you're going to do it again, and you can kind of see how you stack up to your previous results? There are lots of ways you could do it. Some are more formal, I guess, and more exact. If you do something like a simple 20-minute test on a bike, for example, is a pretty easy one and a pretty good test. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to necessarily do that. But you have to have an appreciation for the uncertainty in your result, and the more vague your success metric is, the more uncertainty you are going to have in your result. So
for sure,
feeling better, feeling stronger is important. It's relevant information, but it's still, you still have quite some uncertainty in whether the training worked if the only thing you have to go on is that I'm feeling stronger, but you can't really quantify it necessarily. So, and this is people are very different here, because there are some athletes that are super in tune with like their exact powers. They can tell immediately if I'm 5 watts off or, mm-hmm. or 3 seconds per kilometer off my normal. And then there are some athletes that feel that they're a bit off, but then you show them the data and they're actually 20 watts stronger than they were. Yeah. So this is, you have to know yourself a bit here, but I think that depending on the athlete, your feeling stronger might be valid, but it doesn't apply to everybody. So I would say have some way that you that you're going to track your progress. And like, if you're not going to do formal testing, I would say that your progress in key workouts is a good way to do it. And evaluate then, of course, whether it worked. After, of course, you need to give it, depending on what the intervention is, it might have a shorter or longer timeline, but give it the time that it requires to actually have an effect. Make sure you do things correctly with recovery and so on. And yeah, again, it's not a science experiment. You're not going to control for everything. And I'm not even going to say that you should only change one variable at a time, because from my coaching perspective, I know fully well that is completely unrealistic, and it's going to lead to less optimal training if you're going to limit yourself to that. Yeah. But you have to appreciate if you changed multiple variables at a time and understand the uncertainty that brings to your results, I guess.
I couldn't agree more. But there's also I think there's some compounding effects where you start training, if you're legitimately starting to build fitness, some of the other things may start to get easier too. Like I find that, when training is going real well, my sleep improves, right? And then better sleep, obviously, I don't think we need to debate the value of sleep in life, but in training specifically. If my sleep improves and then also I'm more motivated to eat well, then those are two incredibly important factors that are supporting my training, but it might not be that specific intervention that I've tried. It could be these tangential sort of effects that are actually having more of an effect on the improvement in fitness.
Yeah, and trying a new training method could be a trigger for you to get more motivated.
Exactly.
Which also makes you more motivated to eat well, which then influences your sleep. So it's not the training itself, but actually trying that intervention still had that direct impact. So it's really hard.
Yeah, humans are weird. That's why endurance coaching, sport coaching is so interesting, because there's so many little factors, so many levers we have control over, and they're intertwined sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Getting back to your answer, I think you'd finished, maybe or about to finish step 3, and you still had 4 and 5, and then I totally interrupted you.
So actually that was step 4, experimenting or trialing it.
Yeah.
And then reviewing it was step 5. And that was basically having some kind of success metric or way to evaluate the success of it in place that you decide on in advance, and then I guess knowing the timeline as well, understanding the timeline of when are you going to review it. And you might review it and it's inconclusive, and you decide, okay, I'm gonna do another 4 weeks and see. But I guess the key thing there is to not be a passive passenger in your training, because I think what can happen quite easily is that you see something that looks like a new interesting training method, even though, as we talked about, it probably isn't new, but it may very well be interesting.
Yes.
And you jump on that bandwagon, but then it somehow becomes the default, and it becomes automatic, and you just do it without reviewing whether it's working or not, until something else comes along that is newer and shinier, and then you change, but you actually don't know if the thing that you did was working well or not. So that's the thing to avoid, really, by having in place a system that makes you evaluate how things are going at a certain timeline within that, implementing that intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. So I took away 2 things. The first thing is that I should just be more patient as an interviewer and let you go through your steps, and rather than just ask questions that you're going to get to anyway. But then the second is, making sure that you do monitor it, because I'm guilty, because I've been, self-coached for forever basically. And I'm really guilty of just going with the flow sometimes, of avoiding those tests and avoiding those benchmarks, which I totally agree with you, are real important. So very well taken, Michael.
Yeah. And I think I was thinking about this in terms of technology as well, which I think has a couple of, it's the same process, but there are a couple of other things to consider there. So firstly, on part 2, where I talked about that, as analyzing the history of an intervention, you might not have a history with a new piece of technology, a new device, but sometimes you do. So basically, my point here is that step 2 is maybe less important, but it's not always unimportant. So if you think about something like continuous blood glucose monitoring, when Super Sapiens came along, obviously it was very new to endurance sport. So you didn't have any historical data of using that necessarily in an endurance sports context outside of diabetics, but you had a ton of use cases and application in the medical field. So even if something is new to the field where it's currently being used, it doesn't mean that it's completely new. So you can and should, I think, analyze that also from that kind of step 2, or analyzing the history point of view when that exists, and try to figure out where is this coming from. Because quite often technologies that come into our sport are not new technologies. They're just new applications of technology that already exists, or slight variations on something that already exists.
Sure.
And the other thing that I think is really important is already in step 1, when it comes to new technology, including devices and also metrics, is to understand 4 key concepts: relevance, validity, accuracy, and precision. So relevance means, is this actually important to measure? Does it help us with the problem at hand? And let's say the problem at hand, what is the device trying to solve? But let's say it's training better in some way. Does it actually help? Or recovering better? So that's a pretty relevant one today, because there are a lot of wearables now that claim to help you with recovery, but they do measure things, but do they actually help you with something? So with anything. So the relevance there is an important one to assess. Validity means, does the device measure what it says it does?
Yeah.
So, and that's not always the case. For example, running power meters, they don't measure running power.
Nope.
They estimate it by measuring other things. They use accelerometers. They measure speed in 3 dimensions, and they know your weight, and then they calculate an estimation of running power, but it's not really running power.
That's right. Yeah, they have a model that they've validated in a lab to some extent across some subset of runners, and then they try to map that model onto what you're doing. Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not a direct measurement.
But there's even disagreement there between whether the power is metabolic power or mechanical power. And I think, for example, Stride is a big one, and they have claimed that their power is metabolic power, it's not mechanical power. So then you could argue that how is metabolic power related to things like injury prevention, which is also part of their product or their analysis, because that would be more related to the mechanical power.
For sure. Yeah, that's all force. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So validity, does the device measure what it says it does? Accuracy is how accurately does it measure it? So let's say power meter. My power meter shows that I'm doing 300 watts, but actually I'm doing 350, of course. I have a severely under-reading power meter, as we all do.
As we all do, of course. My power meter, especially lately, has been very, very under-reading my actual power.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So that is accuracy, and precision is, but at least it shows 300 watts every time. So I can still train with it.
Repeatability.
And I think that, So I think that of these 4, accuracy is maybe the least important to some extent, at least when it comes to something that you use in day-to-day training. But something being precise is very important. And of course, that it is relevant if it's not relevant, you're not going to use it. So, but also if it's,
then exactly, why bother?
Yeah, but also if it's not precise, you can't use it, even if you would want to. Yeah. Validity is like a little bit like running power. I think it's not valid as running power. It doesn't mean that it's not potentially a useful metric. I'm not a huge fan, but I'm also not saying that it's useless. So just the fact that it's not really measuring exactly power doesn't mean that it can't have some use. I think it's quite useful for pacing on very like hilly courses on uneven terrain, as long as the ground is the same. If we're talking about
does not work well on trails, famously. Yeah.
No, absolutely not. So those four factors, understanding relevance, validity, accuracy, and precision, those are super important when it comes to that first step of assessing a new technology or a new metric.
Michael, I couldn't agree more. I think that's like, I usually boil mine down to like 2 steps, but they're combining with your four checks. And I couldn't agree more. And the thing that I always think about is one of our favorite topics on our show is aerometers, right? And sometimes they fail all 4. Like sometimes they're not accurate, and sometimes they're not repeatable, and sometimes they're or precise, and sometimes they are those things, but you can't really know exactly what to do with them. Like, so the validity piece is missing unless you have quite a bit of knowledge or quite a bit of time to invest in the investigation. And I think those are very, very important questions to ask. And I think that we don't we actually don't ask them enough when we, I'm the guiltiest of all, because I get really excited about new technology and I want to buy it and try it and then realize that it's, really doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah, no, I think it's super important because it will help you save some money, to be honest, if you do these things, like do this analysis, figure it out before if it could make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things obviously you won't necessarily know. You can't necessarily know if a device is unreliable, like it's not measuring things consistently, so it fails that precision part,
mm-hmm.
because that's something that is, the manufacturer will probably claim that is precise, like they wouldn't say it if it wasn't.
Yes.
So that part you can know, but the relevance and the validity, those are things that at least that you can figure out beforehand. And to some extent, you can maybe have some idea of the accuracy part, even if you understand a bit about the methods by how they measure certain things. But it will probably, in some cases, require quite a lot extensive knowledge about different topics, either physics or biology or medicine or various things, engineering, to figure that out. But at least some of that you can figure out before you actually buy a device.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is very tricky, especially the more, the deeper that we get into, advanced devices, and also now AI assisting with all sorts of analysis, right? So you end up with all these black box sort of, interpretation algorithms that take the raw data and then spit out some kind of output that you're supposed to make sense of. I think then being able to tease out how accurate they are, it becomes even more complicated, because you actually have no idea what it's doing. Like Stride, you don't know what it's doing. You kind of know what it's doing very roughly, but it's that the actual algorithm is, it's proprietary and you don't really know.
Yeah.
Precisely how they go about things.
Yeah, exactly.
We had Antoine on, who we talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about the Omius headband, but he also did the study of the core sensor, right? And it's like, I still use mine, but he was talking about how it's similar to Stride in the sense that it doesn't measure core temperature because it's not inside your body, right? Like it's measuring skin temperature and heat flux. And then from skin temperature and heat flux, again, they've built a model that then models what your core body temperature is doing when your skin temperature is doing this and your skin flux is doing this, and your heart rate, because they use heart rate as well. So again, it's a model that is, if it's useful, great. And Antoine's findings were that, it's useful, but it has some limitations in specific use cases. So I think that nuanced approach to these devices and technologies is probably the best one.
Yeah, no, the core is a great example, because funnily enough, I just ordered mine very recently and I haven't even received it yet.
Nice.
But it's on its way. And it's a device that obviously I've been aware of it for years. And it's been one that I've consistently been relatively quite positive about. Like, I think it all makes sense technology-wise. And eventually I pulled the trigger on buying it. And the reason being that I finally, I think, have enough data without actually having bought the device that it seems to be precise. Because I think that it's an extremely relevant device, and understanding core temperature, especially when you're training for hot races or you're doing some kind of heat prep or racing in the heat, can be extremely relevant. The validity, it's not measuring, like you said, it's not measuring what, like, core temperature directly. It's using a model, it's measuring skin temperature and heat flux. But as I said before, like, that part is not as important as the relevance and the precision part to
Agreed.
me. And the accuracy, I understand, is also not super great. Like, if you compare it to pills, it's going to have an offset.
Yes.
But what I've heard from multiple sources that have used it extensively is that it is quite precise. So it does provide a good tool. It's not perfect. And people that have the means, they don't use just that. They also use temperature pills and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's perfect, but it seems to be good enough that there is an interesting use case there. And that made me decide, okay, I'm going to get it. I'm going to figure out how to use it, because I do think that there can be a decent amount of value in that device. So, but I did apply this exact framework when deciding whether to buy it or not, because I didn't want to waste a couple $100 on anything.
Exactly, right. No, I think, my understanding of it is exactly the same as yours, that there is an offset, but the offset is consistent. And that's really all that matters, because, most of the use cases are you do some heat testing, see how your body temperature, how your core temperature reacts to certain stimuli. And then based on that, you build a training program. And that makes a lot of sense. as long as you can consistently hit as long as you have that repeatability, so you can consistently hit those thermal stress levels in your training, in your prep. Okay, awesome. Michael, I'm going to move us on, sort of staying within the technology world, but I want to speak specifically to metrics, because kind of going back to the big picture of my idea for this episode was, how do we deal with an overwhelming amount of information, and maybe some of the information is poor and some of the information is valid, and all of these devices that we have, and specifically in triathlon, watches and head units on our computers, on our bike computers, they can present a dizzying array of data now. And so in your coaching practice, what do you focus on, and what do you focus on, and what do you think is less important?
Okay, so the preamble here, you can go through the exact same exercise with the metrics as with any piece of technology there, understanding the relevance, validity, accuracy and precision of it, and then decide based on that whether it makes sense to use it. And obviously devices these days, they do capture a lot of metrics automatically. So just because it captures and some software calculates additional metrics automatically, etc. So I'm not saying that you should delete the ones that come through that you don't like or that don't make sense within this model. But you need to understand which metrics you want to focus on, because focusing on everything is going to lead that you're pretty bad at everything. Like, you're not going to do a good job.
Yeah, agreed.
So you need to figure out which are the ones to focus on. And I would encourage anybody to get really good at what you're doing within a more narrow focus when it comes to these things. And I think it's pretty simple which ones make sense. Mm-hmm. It's heart rate in all disciplines, even swimming potentially, even though I'm not making my athletes wear heart rate monitors in the pool, but you can do. Mm-hmm. Certainly for bike and run, it's important. Pace on the run and in swimming, speed on the bike, power on the bike, and RPE. And other subjective data like workout comments. So those are the big ones, and the ones that I think, if you are really good at using those, even for self-coach athletes, writing workout comments, logging your RPE is extremely useful. Like, you can't really evaluate any intervention if you don't do that. I don't see how, because you can look at the data from training, you can see the power to heart rate, but you cannot really know whether heart rate was lower in relation to power because you were tired, mm-hmm. or because you're getting fitter, unless you actually rated an RPE and you wrote a comment about whether you felt good or you felt tired.
Yeah, your glycogen depleted on a long run, and you just can't produce the power anymore.
Exactly. So
hang on, I got a quick follow-up question. So everything you're saying totally jives with my understanding of the world, except for one thing that jumped out was, you said speed on the bike. So that's one thing that I've always told folks to ignore. So I'm very curious to hear why you think speed on the bike is as an important metric to track.
You have to, you always have to look at it in the context of your training, of course. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, in a race, it's not your power that's determining how fast you, your power determines how fast you go in some way, but it's not your power that matters. That's not what's on the results sheet. It's the speed. So and coming back to the point about some power meters might have an offset, if you're consistently pushing extremely good power, but you're going pretty slowly, then that's okay. You can still train to your power, but maybe we need to have the understanding that either we need to figure out what's going on with your speed. Why is it so slow? Are you very poor aerodynamically? Is there some mechanical inefficiencies or equipment things that need to be?
Do you have an exceptionally dirty chain?
Exceptionally dirty chain, yeah.
That happened with one of the folks I was working with. We had that problem. It's and then he cleaned and lubed his chain, and then he became a superstar. Oh wow, relatively speaking.
Yeah. You can get so much time, especially over an Ironman. That can add up to so much. Yeah. And so you need to pay attention to that, because if you don't, then if you only pay attention to power, then you're going to show up on race day with that dirty chain, not understanding mm-hmm. why you're so much slower than everybody else, even though your power is really good. Yeah. So it does matter. I would say I prescribe workouts based on power, mostly power and RPE and heart rate, a combination of those, not so much based on speed, although sometimes I do prescribe workouts that are go at kind of a race pace or race power, but try to really ride a course that kind of simulates the race course and try to get as much speed as you can out of the power, focusing on the speed. Not the power is less important. It should be roughly around where you want to be on average, but it means like pushing over the hills and getting up to speed and all of those sorts of things. So speed can come into things, and paying attention to it in general is important for understanding your performance capacity, your performance limiters, where you are, where you can improve. And yeah, so it is just as important, I think. It's basically with speed and with power, you have a way of assessing your overall efficiency on the bike.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I'm back on board with speed. I think, as a means of looking at assessing efficiency, and mostly probably between workouts, because there's probably not a ton you can do. I mean, unless you're doing dedicated sort of Chung method aero testing stuff, then speed within a workout probably isn't telling you a ton. But unless to your point, you're assigning a workout where speed is the objective, which is an interesting way to do it. And sometimes maybe that's, like we were talking about novelty earlier on when we were talking about training interventions. Sometimes like workout prescription novelty is fun too. It's just like, hey, today you're going to run based on this metric and not the metric that you're used to running. And let's see what happens. Like run to RPE or ride to speed and see how that works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but that I think is the summary of the metrics. And there are situations, of course, where other metrics might come into things. Sometimes I do lactate testing and let's see now how this core sensor project goes. That could be an interesting one. But I mean, those are for sure the 99% of your gains are going to come from from those metrics that I just listed. And then there are a ton of metrics that people use that I would say fail one or multiple of the important tests, either relevance or validity, and maybe that's something that you want to talk about, because that could be interesting. For example, like TSS and TSS derived metrics like CTL, for me, they are relevant, because if you could measure like an all-encompassing training load metric, that would be useful. However, they are not valid, in my opinion, because there are so many ways of breaking them. So if you go out and do an extremely stochastic ride,
yes,
you will get an extremely inflated TSS. Or when I go and do a swim in the pool, but I use my wetsuit because I'm preparing for a race, then that's also going to give me extremely inflated TSS. Of course, the transferability between different disciplines is extremely poor. So there are just too many limitations to make it valid in any way. Even within a single sport like cycling, races are so stochastic, and you would have like these NP busting efforts within them that makes it not super useful. The only situation where I would see it being useful is if you're a pure cyclist, but your focus is more on not on road cycling, but maybe something longer and steadier like gravel, something like that, or ultra cycling. Then I think that it would be much more valid, and then I would consider using it. But in a triathlon context, I for sure don't. I think that the validity just isn't there.
Yeah, I think it's the interplay between, especially the interplay between the three sports. I think that's the most challenging of the things for TSS. But I totally agree with you. You can totally blow it up. It's very easy to do if you're doing some sprint training to break their model.
Yeah, even on running, like if you run a very hilly course, it doesn't, even like with running power, it doesn't, in my opinion, at all reflect how much harder a very hilly run is compared to a flat run when using the TSS model. So yeah, I think in all, and swimming is terrible because of all the equipment. There's no way of accounting for that. And
sure,
if even 25-meter pool versus 50-meter pool, running, different shoes, are using super shoes or not, that's maybe a more minor detail. So, and I'm not going to like be super critical about minor differences there, but I think all in all, like it's just not a valid metric.
Since we're talking about this was not on my kind of very high level cue sheet for today, but if you're not using TSS, and I totally agree with you, it's a pretty sloppy metric, but if you're not using that, what's your volume metric?
It's volume, and using things like 3-month rolling average of volume or 6-week rolling average of volume, because I know that intensity is going to be relatively consistent. There are maybe different periods, but it's going to be consistently at a level that the athlete can tolerate. But there is going to be intensity, whether it's race pace or threshold or VO2 max or whatever it might be. There is always going to be some intensity in the program. So within, let's say, a 15-hour week, I know that, okay, like I think the intensity just evens out over time. So I think that with volume, like that's where, and even you could even look at, at least in cycling, you could look at kilojoules, and that would also show you that the big thing, the big factor is really volume. So I look at volume and especially things like the 3-month rolling average.
Interesting. Okay. And I mean, like, honestly, it's the easiest metric to capture, right? Like it's the time between you press start and you press stop on your device, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Michael, this has been a great chat. I mean, it's also really nice to catch up. It's been more than 2 years since we've had you on the show, but I know you and I have exchanged emails here and there, but it's always a treat to have these conversations, to kind of bounce some ideas off of you and to get your take on it. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sitting down with me today.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with all the relevant links. I have a couple of follow-up points that I want to mention and take the opportunity, since I have the luxury of republishing and being able to add things that we maybe didn't get to discuss in the actual episode. First, when Michael asked me about resources that I couldn't really think of many off the top of my head at that moment in time. And then he did ask for, or I sent in a list that he put in his show notes for the episode. So they are all there. And I will add them to my show notes as well, of course. And I even remembered a few more. So probably the most exhaustive list to date will be in these show notes on scientifictriathlon.com or in your podcast app, wherever you're listening to this episode. I'll put all of in the actual show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. I'll maybe put a bit more of a description of why I like a particular resource, if I have the time to do that, with it being the holiday season and everything, and things being a little bit more hectic than normal. But anyway, you will have a list of resources there. I won't name them here right now. There's one other topic that I want to talk about in a bit more detail that we didn't discuss this in the interview, but I think it's a really good framework to use around a lot of the topics we discussed in the interview and in general in this information age that we're living in. And that is the DIKW pyramid, which stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. So let's briefly cover what that means. Basically, it's a pyramid with data at the bottom all the way up to wisdom at the top. So data is basically the facts that we collect. 15 degrees Celsius is data. It's a data point. But we don't know anything more about it. We don't know if it's the indoor temperature in your house, it's the outdoor temperature, or is it your fridge temperature, in which case it might be broken. So data in itself means nothing. We don't yet know what the facts mean or how they relate to anything. This is where information is the next step. It is more organized and contextualized data. So it starts to have some basic meaning, and this could be, for example, the temperature outside is 15 degrees Celsius right now. So now we have some context. We can answer questions like what, where, and when. Where is outside, when is right now, that sort of thing. Knowledge takes information and brings in additional understanding about this information. It's information basically that has meaning. It can be understood and connected to prior experiences. So for me, for example, knowing that it is 15 degrees outside right now, I can answer questions like, how should I dress for my bike ride to be comfortable? For somebody who maybe comes and visits me from a much warmer climate, and maybe they are not really a cyclist, they're used to running, but not to cycling. So they might not have really a lot of notion about how to dress for rides. They might end up dressing inadequately for this ride in a cooler climate than they're used to living in a sport that they're not used to practicing, even though they have the exact same information that I do. They know the temperature, they know probably the wind speed, all of those things, the humidity, but they don't have the knowledge, which is additional understanding about the information. So this, I think, is a simple but powerful example that illustrates the difference between information and knowledge, because we are living in an information age, but it is important to be aware that information is not the same as knowledge. And I think this is a simple but good example that shows that. And finally, wisdom is knowledge applied. So let's say I have two friends coming to visit me from warmer climates, and they're joining me for my ride. And one of these friends is a very powerful, muscular guy who I know will generate a lot of power and create a lot of heat. He also has the build of somebody that doesn't get cold too easily. The other friend is very small and slender, and I know that they don't produce that big power or heat. And they also don't have a whole lot of insulation to keep them warm on their body, that is. So I will account for these facts, and I will also account for the fact that I know that the ride we're going to do has some long descents where the speeds will be high, even if you don't have a big power to push, and it's easy to get cold basically on this course. And knowing all of this, I can apply the knowledge that I have about the current temperature, the ride, physiology, my friends, their builds, and so on. I can apply all of that and give different clothing recommendations for these two friends using my experience and my judgment and considering a broader set of inputs than just the number on the thermometer. So we're starting to get into concepts here like bringing in slightly different fields. So to understand, to have wisdom around temperature, I also have to have some understanding and knowledge about physiology, anatomy, all those sorts of things. This is what wisdom is. It's maybe a bit harder to explain exactly, and I'm not even sure that I don't have the perfect definition at least. But basically, when we're getting to the point of really being good at consistently applying knowledge effectively, that I would say is wisdom, and that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. There is definitely some criticism of this model. It is not perfect, but I think it can be a useful one to consider. Basically, the main point here is that we are kind of drowning in a sea of information if we're not careful. And this might be new devices that bring us new metrics where there is context, there is data processing, and there is organization. So it's information, it's not just data, but it's still not necessarily knowledge or wisdom. It might also be, you might be reading breakdowns of new research studies. You might see breakdowns of them on Instagram. But taking the step from information, that is a piece of information, to actual knowledge, and especially from knowledge to wisdom. So how do you actually apply the results from that research study in the real world? That's a whole different kettle of fish. That's where the crux is, and that is what is so important. So I think that a key takeaway is try to be a thinker rather than a data hoarder or an information hoarder. That at least is what I'm trying to do. I'd rather have less information, but more knowledge and wisdom. And I believe that leads to better results. So this is an example of why in the discussion about metrics, I recommended focusing on a few and becoming really exceptional at understanding a few basic metrics that are fundamentally important. And pretty much I would almost go as far as discouraging using any metrics beyond those few, simply because it's a waste of resources that you could be using in a better way. It's not to say that other metrics are not useful, but it's an opportunity cost. So this way of thinking can also be applied, of course, when assessing new technology and potential training interventions. If you buy a device, for example, it will mostly give you information, maybe a bit of knowledge, but the stumbling block is always the wisdom, the applied knowledge, and it might take you thousands of hours to get to the point where you can honestly say that you have learned to take the information and the knowledge provided by device to actionable insight that improves your results. So the question then is that time investment worth it, even when you consider what else you could have invested that time on? And it could be that it's worth it. It will depend on each individual case, but it's something that you have to consider. So I guess another takeaway or a similar takeaway is that a lot of what we consume, whether it be stuff we read or hear on social media or metrics that we get from our devices, it is information. It is stuck at the information level of the pyramid. And information in itself is pretty useless. It is only when you get to the point of applying it with wisdom that you really start benefiting from it. And for this reason, how I invest my education time is much less into the information level of the pyramid and more at those higher levels of the pyramid, at trying to learn how to take information and turn it into knowledge and turn it into wisdom. And when you look at the resources that are recommended, at least some of them will probably show you hints of that as well. So I think that I just wanted to cover this simply because I think it is quite related to the topics we discussed in the interview. And I think it's just a very useful framework for knowledge, for information, for all of these things that in this day and age, it's critical to, I guess, have some level of understanding of how you think and how you process information. All right, that's enough about that. I want to remind you once again that we have training camps that are open for registration in 2025. We have training camps in Mallorca from the 5th to the 12th of April and in the Algarve in Portugal from the 26th of April to the 3rd of May. And for the Algarve one, we have limited slots available. I'm recording quite some time in advance, so right now we have 3 slots available for the Algarve camp, but that might be different when you're listening to this, so I do recommend getting in your registration quickly. For Mallorca, we're not at the point of filling up yet, so you have a bit more time there, but still, better to do it sooner rather than later. And if you're considering it, please let me know, email me, and we can discuss if there are any questions that you have or you want to know more. Of course, there's lots of information on our website, on scientifictriathlon.com, and I will link to those pages directly in the episode description and show notes as well. And yeah, I think that if you love triathlon and you love experiencing incredible locations, riding on beautiful roads, and enjoy having some camaraderie with fellow triathletes and enjoy training together, then this will be a really fantastic week of training, perhaps the best week of your year, where you can not only get really effective training done, set yourself up for a great season of racing, but also learn more about how to further optimize your own training process through the interactions with other athletes and of course with us coaches. So we always have a great time. The Mallorca camp we are running for the 4th year in a row, and it's always a blast. So I hope to see you there, and let me know if you have any questions. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors. Also, Happy New Year to the entire team at Precision Fuel and Hydration. You can find them on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And if you're looking for high quality, practical, and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure to try Precision Fuel and Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to choose, so you can easily find your personal favorite. And don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.